Hello, you cheeky criminals. Very quickly before we dive into today's video, I just want to say that I read your comments from last week's video. Sorry I haven't been able to get to all of them, but I heard you loud and clear. We will continue keeping these true crime cases, these live true crime stream breakdowns here on this channel. Because if you don't know, these videos, the video you're about to watch, they're just edited down versions of my Twitch live streams where I cover these cases, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep them here on this channel or not, since I don't think they're the best quality, since they're one camera, but you guys said you want to keep them here, and so they will remain here. That said, I have even bigger and more exciting videos coming your way, including some new travel content, but I'll share more of that in an exciting announcement video next week. Until then, let's dive into today's true crime case. The case of Korea's Frog Boys. Today's case is a very famous South Korean cold case, a very famous South Korean unsolved mystery that we're digging into. It's known as the case of the missing Frog Boys. Despite the fact that it was a Tuesday on March 26, 1991, many people in South Korea were not at work or school, but rather enjoying time with their family and friends. It was the day of local elections, a day that was treated like a public holiday in South Korea. On this day of fun and frolicking, something much more sinister was lurking in the mountainside, a predator waiting for prey. 5 young boys, all between the ages of 9 and 13 years old, met up to look for salamander eggs and perhaps even catch frogs in the hills of Mount Waryong. The mountain was just located behind their school and only little more than a mile away from their homes in a small village in Daegu, located in Yongsan district. There are some that say that the boys were accidentally named the Frog Boys due to a media error, and that they had only intended to search for salamanders and their eggs. The 5 boys' real names were, firstly, Woo Cheol-won, and again, apologies if I butcher these names. Woo Cheol-won, 13 years old, Cho Ho-yeon, 12 years old, Kim Yong-gyu, 11 years old, Park Jang-in, 10 years old, Kim Jong-sik, 9 years old. So what exactly happened to these 5 young boys? They were children, which is what makes this case even more tragic. There was another boy named Kim Tae-woo who was age 10 who came with them to start, but turned around and went home early because he had not had breakfast that morning. A decision which, obviously, one that saved his life. As the boys left the village for the hills, this was the last time they were ever seen alive. They never returned, and the long and exhaustive search for these boys has haunted South Korea for years in what has since been called one of Korea's, and I quote, most painful and sensational cold cases. So how did the search begin? Well, firstly, when the boys did not return home by the end of the day, their parents became, understandably, frantic. With the help of the school and other students, the search began by handing out flyers with their photos around the town and neighboring areas of Daegu. And as some have suspected, or at least the media have latched on, based on the assumption that they were out on an amphibian search, they were dubbed infamously the Frog Boys. South Korea's president at the time, Tae-woo, took the disappearance very, very seriously, calling for search parties across the country, assigning as many as 300,000 police officers to take part in the cause, and encouraging many more residents to volunteer to enlist in their search. In addition, people throughout Korea donated generously in support of this cause. Schools, companies, and civic groups alone are said to have raised what amounted to $35,000 US, which was 42 million won in South Korea at the time, to help fund the continuing search and possible reward for valuable information. Updates and footage from the search efforts were even broadcast live on South Korean news television programs. Again, this case, it obviously captured the nation. I mean, probably because of how young these boys were. I mean, I think if 5 boys in the US disappeared at that age, I think it would also make national headlines. During this search, the police's search was frustrated by the many false reports they were receiving that the boys had been spotted. Mount Waryong, and apologies again if I'm mispronouncing it, Mount Waryong, this mountain was searched 500 times without a single trace of evidence. And you can imagine that they probably really put a lot of effort into these searches, yet they couldn't find a single thing. The nearby reservoirs and irrigation waterways were also searched extensively. Bus, train, and other transportation hubs were monitored and searched. Despite the amount of resources being put into the search, the boys' families grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of results. Understandably so. I mean, while it is great that, you know, the Korean law enforcement, Korean president, all these people, these civic groups, they were raising money, they were doing all these searches. It must have been incredibly frustrating to know that all this effort was being put in and nothing was being found. Maybe not even necessarily frustrating, but also just like disheartening. Because it'd be one thing if you were searching for a lost loved one, but you weren't getting the help and you'd feel like, oh, we're not doing enough. We're not doing as much as we can. But in this case, it seemed like they were doing as much as they could and there was nothing. One of the boys' uncles reportedly told the media that since the boys played on this mountain so much, it didn't make any sense for them to get lost there, and essentially said that the only reason they would not return is if they had been killed. So the police should be focusing on finding the cause of their deaths. The father of Kim Yong-yu criticized that the parents had tried to tell the police the boys were not the kind of kids who would just leave home on their own accord, and that the investigation was being led in the wrong direction. Sadly, many of the boys' parents gave up their jobs to devote themselves fully to traveling around the country in search of their sons. It's something I think most parents would do in that position if they had to. At one point in the search, there was a disturbing break in the case when one man falsely claimed to be the boys' kidnapper, hoping to extort a ransom from the families and authorities. In one of this man's phone calls to the police, he reportedly told them that the boys were dying of malnutrition and that he was willing to exchange the boys for a ransom. How fucked up does someone have to be to take advantage of a situation like this to do that? And unfortunately, I don't think my research gives much more insight into what happened to this man, but I would hope that he was caught and locked up. Until the early 2000s, the police still operated a special investigation center devoted to the search for the Frog Boys. It is estimated that as many as 350,000 man-days were devoted to the search for them over the years. But now we go to the date of September 26th, 2002. And on this date, the boys' bodies were found by authorities after they were informed by a local newspaper that they had received an anonymous tip on where they could be located and excavated. Tragically, and perhaps ironically, they were found in the foothills of Mount Waryong. And I get chills when I say this. And so all along, they were just a little over a mile away from home. Now, I don't know how they weren't found, considering how extensively the mountain was searched. Maybe their bodies were then put there after the search. I don't know. The tip to the newspaper came in on September 25th, 2002, and those who spoke to the man described him as sounding like a middle-aged man. Police were able to use caller ID to trace the anonymous call to a 55-year-old man named Cheol-won, who was picking acorns with a friend on Mount Waryong when he found pieces of shoes and clothing and observed what he believed to be 5 skulls, immediately thinking it could be the long missing Frog Boys' remains. So the person who called in, initially not really suspected as the person who had perpetrated this. This was someone who just stumbled upon the remains. Kim Soo-hwan, the police officer, was also certain they had found the Frog Boys' remains, as all the bodies were found together. The shoes they had found matched the description of those the boys had been wearing at the time of the disappearance, and one of the boys' remains showed he had braces, which was immediately presumed to be the body of Cheol-won. Some of the boys' parents were brought to the scene to identify the bodies, though most were in too much of a state of shock to be able to comment, understandably. Cheol-won's mother was at the scene of the crime. She was in such a disassociative state, she reportedly said, "I cannot remember whether my son had braces or not." Absolutely heartbreaking. Jade Wolf asked, why would they drag their parents to see the bodies? The effect should be enough in all the trauma of seeing the bodies. I think, and I don't know for a fact, but I would maybe think that they wanted the parents to identify the bodies, right? Because I believe it's normally someone has, at least in the US, right? That the bodies have to be identified by like a family member, a loved one or something. One of the boys' fathers had passed away of cancer only the year before at the age of 49. Devastatingly, he had given up much of his life to travel across South Korea looking for his son and would not learn of his son's fate in his lifetime. I feel like we've covered a lot of cases here which have been very frustrating. Some of them are very gory, very gruesome, very upsetting. This one's just, It's just heartbreaking. Immediately, many thought the circumstances under which the boys were found pointed to foul play. Once again, the boys were found just over a mile from home in an area they played in often and knew incredibly well. Additionally, the boys' bodies were found so their heads were laying very close together and in a manner where they were seemingly either holding each other or tied together. There was also a 5-centimeter long loaded bullet shell and 2 1-centimeter long empty shells found near the boys' bodies. It was very bizarre if they all just died of a cold at the same time, Nelly. So that's why I would assume foul play. But, however, not long after the bodies were excavated, police announced that there were, and I quote, no indications of a homicide so far, and that the most likely explanation was that the children had frozen to death. I don't know what you guys think. That just seems a bit odd to me, considering, again, based on what we know, the boys were just a mile away from their home in an area they knew incredibly well, and they all succumbed to the elements. The police suggested that the boys were entwined in a manner that meant they had tried to huddle together to escape the cold. They explained the shell casings as something the boys could have found from the ground and picked up or played with because there was a shooting practice field run by the 50th Division of the Army less than 1,000 feet from the scene of the crime. Now, understandably, much like with the Twitch chat, the police's statement sparked something of an uproar with the public and the boys' families, and with pretty good reason. There was rather a lot of obvious evidence of physical damage to the boys' skulls to imply they had been murdered. The National Institute of Scientific Investigation, NISI, and scientists from the forensic medicine team from Gyeongbuk National University both got involved in the investigation, and within 6 weeks had come to the conclusion that the boys had died of blunt force head trauma and cranial injuries. I was just so ready to give the police in this case some credit for their attempts early on to solve this case. They went to that mountain 500 times, but once again, law enforcement falling short, because you see, at least 3 of the boys' skulls had been caved in and showed numerous cracks and holes. Not sure how the police missed that, and not sure why the police would assume they've died of the cold when their skulls have been caved in. A representative from the forensic team said in his statement, and I quote, "We found marks on 3 of the 5 skulls that appeared to be created by blows with metal objects, possibly a tool of some kind." Pak Jin-so, the father of one of the boys, said, "I am crushed by a new kind of grief. It was good to see the absurd argument of the police that they froze to death disproved. If their killers have any conscience, they must be suffering tremendously by now." I would hope that's the case. But, I mean, if you are someone capable of killing 5 young boys, I don't know if you got much of a conscience. In response to the news, the families urged the police once again to find their children's killer or killers and their motive. The police, however, I'm clenching my fist here, once again found it hard to believe that without any motive that their murder would be premeditated, but that the killer may have been enraged quickly, lending perhaps to the idea that they could have been a person experiencing severe psychosis or dysfunctional personality. They also said they would look into the possibility that they could have been killed by bullies closer to them in age. Once the investigation was over and the autopsies had revealed all they could, the boys were finally buried on March 25th, 2004. Their skulls were donated for medical research to Gyeongbuk University. Despite the authorities vowing to do everything they could to find the perpetrator, no other forms of clues or evidence were ever discovered. In 2006, exactly 15 years after the crime had occurred, South Korea's statute of limitations on murder expired, meaning the investigation was called to be ended and the boys' murderer or murderers would never be prosecuted for their crimes. Alt Fanny says murder shouldn't have statutes of limitations. And Jeremy says the same thing. There shouldn't be a statute of limitations on murder. I completely agree. The Frog Boys family still wanted justice for their son, so much so that they began to advocate for the government to abolish or extend the statute of limitations so that their son's fates would not yet be abandoned. In response, the police said they would keep the case open, saying that from their side of the law at least, the purpose of the investigation was to find the truth, not just to punish criminals, which is just, it's insane to me that a criminal could get away with it just because of how long it takes the police to solve the case. The police are also keeping the 31 million won, 31,000 US dollars remaining in reward money for anyone who comes with information. Some of it went to the men. The previous reward money went to the men who discovered the bodies. In 2015, South Korea's National Assembly officially voted almost unanimously to remove the statute of limitations on first-degree murder, so that it is still possible that if the Frog Boys killer is found, he could be charged for his crimes, or she. Even to this day, the theories on what happened to the Frog Boys range from outlandish and conspiratorial. For many years, there was a theory that extraterrestrial beings could have abducted the boys. That's the first time we've covered an unsolved case where aliens were blamed. Due to the political tensions between North and South Korea, there were always ramblings that North Korea could have also had some role in the Frog Boys' disappearance. Some speculated the boys could have been abducted and tortured. Some even had political conspiracies even closer to home, with a faction of people believing the South Korean military could have been involved. There was a military base operation also isolated in the hills of Mount Waryong, and if the boys had approached it too closely, they may have actually been perceived as a threat and attacked. The case of the Frog Boys has been the subject of documentaries and a South Korean crime thriller called Children, released on February 17th, 2011. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a broad overview of the missing Frog Boys. An unsolved mystery which continues to plague South Korea to this day. While it's great that, to a degree, we know what happened to the boys as far as their bodies being found, it's, like I said, this case, I got chills several times as I was going through it with you all, and it's just heartbreaking all around.